I've started a study of the wise men several years ago because I was just perplexed by it. I would read Matthew, and then it's like, okay, it feels like we could just take this story out, and you wouldn't miss it. Like, because you have Luke's account, and Matthew still has, like a birth account, and so it's like if the story of the Magi was gone, you were like, well, what are you missing? And when you put it in, it almost seems out of place. It's like, okay, we're going along, all right, Jesus' genealogy, birth, weird thing, wise men show up, okay, now on with the rest of the story. So why is it there? Like, what is Matthew trying to do, and why is it so important? And it just seems like just so, I mean, it's familiar in one sense because it's always been a part of like the Christmas story, right? But then it's like, well, is it just a, hey, cool thing that happened? Why is it there? What's the connection? I felt like I was missing something. I did feel like kind of arrived at made some connections, and it brought it more alive to me, and much more interesting actually. So let's do a little popcorn. What do we know, or what do we think we know about the wise men? They're from Babylon? Okay. Ish, maybe? It says it came from the east. You go far enough east, you can get pretty west of Israel, I guess. Larry? Uh-huh.
It may already be obvious from what we said, but they were Gentiles, so they were not part of the Jewish nation.
Gentiles. And I had initially wondered, it's like, well, it doesn't say that, but the way Matthew talks about them, it's so, just you look at the literature, he's making a contrast between what they're doing as Gentiles and the Israelite response. So even though there were Jews in the dispersion, I do think they are Gentiles. It seems pretty clear. Anything else? They knew something about stars, at least, right? Of course, there's the how many were there? Right, we don't know. More than one, right? Yeah.
Seems interesting to me that they had such an insight that something important was happening with the stars, but they had to ask about what the Bible said about where he was going to go.
Yes, that's a good point, and we'll get to that. We'll unpack that a little bit. I think consider Matthew's original audience, Jews. He's writing to Jews, and he's making a case, a very Jewish case for the Messiah. Like, hey, look at all these Old Testament things that are lining up and coming true. Jesus is the son of David. He is the Messiah. So with that background, and Matthew makes lots of, even uses specific language and even says it in a certain way that is a way that a Jew would get it more readily than a Greek might be, what's going on here. So we have to understand that audience. And when he talks about the wise men, doesn't give us a lot of details. So there's something that's probably he's assuming that the audience, his immediate audience, would understand about that. Yes. Uh-huh.
In the east and followed the star.
Uh-huh.
Where in the Old Testament does it reference a star?
It does reference a star in Numbers 24:17, the prophecy of Balaam, which is also interesting because he was a Gentile. And in his prophecy, he references a star coming out of Bethlehem, I believe. Now, that's the only star kind of. Stars are used a lot in imagery of kings and things like that, so there's more references to stars, but as far as a direct link to the Messiah, I think that's about all we have. So as far as, hey, there's going to be a star that tells us where or when the Messiah is going to be, there is no such Old Testament prophecy that we have. They were studying something, yeah. So what? Yeah. So there's stuff that we immediately know that we don't know, right? Because it's not said in Matthew. Let's think as a Jew. So you hear this, and Matthew mentions wise men from the east. Well, the first thing you're probably going to think of when you mention wise men from the east, you're going to think, oh, I remember some stories about wise men in the east. Like if I mention a place like, hey, we were passing through Gettysburg, or hey, we were at Ellis Island, or I mentioned these other prominent places in the U.S. that are famous because something happened there. It's like, oh yeah, Gettysburg, Civil War, Gettysburg Address, stuff like that. Okay. You mention wise men from the East, a Jew thinks, oh, our people were in the East in captivity for a long time, and in fact, some of our most famous Jews were wise men. Do we remember some Jews that were wise men? We got Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those were all wise men. In fact, Daniel was made head wise man, and that was during the Babylonian Empire. And then when the Persians came in, Daniel was the head wise man in that empire. So he was head wise man in 2 administrations in the East. So when I made that connection, I was like, whoa, there's got to be something here then, right? So if you study, well, let me go back for a second.
Can I read that passage in Numbers?
Yeah, go ahead and read that passage in Numbers, references a star.
I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth from Jacob, and a scepter shall rise from Israel, and crush through the forehead of Moab, and tear down all the sons of Judah.
So I would call that an allusion by Matthew. He's referencing this star/king imagery tied to the Messiah. Also, I think it's also cool that Balaam, a Gentile, that prophecy came from here. And we're talking about Gentiles. Before Israel went into captivity, well, actually, as they were going into captivity, there was kind of several instances where they kind of kept taking more and more of them into captivity. In 2 Kings 24, it talks about how all who were carried away, this is called the brain drain. They took all the best and brightest and strongest with them. Like, hey, if we can only take so many at a time, we're going to take, we're going to take your nobility, we're going to take all your craftsmen, we're going to take all your best thinkers and your strongest workers. They took all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, all the craftsmen and the smiths, carried away Jehoiakim, the king's mother, the king's wives, his officials, and the chief men of the land, and brought them into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. And then we see in Daniel chapter 2, early bits of Daniel, you find a lot about the wise men. Daniel and his friends and any other Jews that maybe we don't have mentioned were likely made eunuchs, a very painful process and barbaric process, and were placed in as wise men because we got the smartest people, now we're going to bring you in. Daniel 2, we have the wise men also talked about. You have these wise men and enchanters and magicians and astrologers and Chaldeans mentioned all together. So it may be that when we talk about wise men, it's like, are we just talking about wise men, or is it a certain kind of wise men? Oh, is it? I didn't even make that connection. Mordecai. Oh, yeah, he was brought up into second in command. I forgot about that, yeah.
I think all men
Right,
But a wise man in here is reference to someone whose job is.
right. It's definitely their job, and it's associated, it's at least associated with these other pagan things, if not directly connected to pagan things. So the enchanters, magicians, astrologers, not astrologers. So we have Daniel and his companions counted among the wise men. Daniel is promoted. So what does Daniel know about the Messiah? Because if Daniel knows something about the Messiah, and Daniel's the head wise man over 2 administrations, could it be that that passes on or establishes something, some line of teaching, or something that is passed on down to future wise men in that area? And there are some explicitly messianic prophecies in Daniel. In fact, some of them get very specific about, like, not every prophecy is necessarily a foretelling of something. Something is prophesied in Isaiah. There's a lot of things that's like, hey, this is messianic, but it also has like there's an immediate audience and impact for that prophecy. It's prophetic in 2 ways. But some of these prophecies in Daniel, it's like, hey, there's going to be this kingdom that comes up, and then this next kingdom, and they're going to do this, and they're going to split it into 4, and then it explains it explicitly. Like, hey, it's going to be the Persians are going to come, and then it's going to be the Greeks, and then they're going to split it into 4, and then there's going to be this really great big empire, and that's Rome. And it's very explicit about all these things. And about times, it's very explicit. There's a lot of debate about Daniel, and it's like, okay, when it talks about 70 weeks and there's going to be this Messiah figure, okay, is that like a literal, like some sort of timing mechanism? Is that a figurative language just saying that there's going to be this big time that happens before the Messiah? The debate being what it is, we can at least say for sure that Daniel knows stuff about the Messiah. It's also fair to say that not everything that Daniel learned as a prophet from God is in the book of Daniel. This is not an exhaustive account of every prophecy Daniel ever received in the book of Daniel. Yes, Ken?
I think it's really interesting when you think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how they were cast into the fire. They looked in and they didn't see 3, they saw 4.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them was the Son of God.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Daniel, knowing them, would have to have been a partaker of the conversation whenever they got together and they began to talk about the Son of God.
Sure, yeah.
What was shared in that, what was important to that, because he was there talking with them. He was there in the furnace with them, walking around with them. So that experience was probably shared with Daniel.
Undoubtedly, right? So if you didn't hear that, so when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the fire, and then there was that 4th one with him like a son of God. Whatever was shared, whatever that experience was like for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, would they have told someone about that, or they just kept it to themselves? Well, obviously Daniel got a hold of it because it's in his book. But even others, would they not have shared that? Daniel, as head wise man, and these 3 is pretty high up. Would they have not shared their faith with others, especially those with whom they worked with, other wise men? So whatever they had, I gotta believe that they passed it on. We uphold Daniel as like this, one of the greats, in the Bible, man of great faith. Would he have not have shared that faith with those around him? I tend to think yes. And if you're the guy that's in charge of basically all the wise men, even if they're super pagan and super just worldly, you have some influence there. And we know Daniel knows something about the Messiah. In fact, it's Gabriel who explains a lot of the messianic prophecies, and Gabriel is only mentioned in connection with Jesus and the time of Jesus. John the Baptist, the Roman Empire, and the birth of Jesus. It's the only time you see him. You see him in Old Testament and New Testament. New Testament, you see him appearing to Mary. Old Testament, we see him with Daniel. So here's another connection between the wise men and the birth of Jesus. And then, regardless of what we know from Scripture, what we can say that Daniel did know, there could be plenty of things that Daniel knew and passed on after the writing of this, or maybe that weren't included in this, just like there are lots of letters that Paul wrote to various churches that we don't have. So there's definitely a connection of teaching, and whatever Daniel knew, I got to think that he shared it. Yes, Mike?
One of the minor prophets, Zechariah, he foretold the coming of the wise men, which we don't always know.
Yeah, share that. Zechariah foretelling the coming of the wise men.
Zechariah chapter 6, verses 10 to 11. Held I to Elijah, and this is referencing something that happened during the exile. And then he makes the prophecy about the wise men coming. Held I to Elijah and Jedaiah, who will bring gifts of silver and gold from the Jews exiled in Babylon. The same day they arrived, meet them at the home of Josiah, son of Zephaniah, where they will stay. Accept their gifts, make from them a crown from silver and gold. Then put the crown on the head of Joshua, which is another name that could be translated Jesus,
Uh-huh.
the son of Josadak, the high priest. Tell him that the Lord Almighty says you represent the man who will come, whose name is the branch. He will grow up from himself and will build the temple of the Lord. To him belongs the royal title. He will rule both as king and as priest, with perfect harmony between the two. Then put the crown into the temple of the Lord to honor those who gave it, Heldai, Tobijah, and Jedaiah, and also Josiah. These three who have come from so far away represent many others who will someday come from distant lands to rebuild the temple of the Lord. And when this happens, you will know that my messages have been from God, the Lord Almighty. But none of this will happen unless you carefully obey the commandments of the Lord your God.
And a good Jew would know this story. And even if they didn't see it as a direct prophecy, they're like, hey, this is at least, a correlation, another picture. Because all of these are pictures. Daniel's full of pictures, and it's this picture of three gifts. I mean, all these things, the imagery is powerful and ties together. It's a very Jewish thing. So when the Jews hear this story of the wise men, they're like, okay, I get it. There's this connection. Make sure I wasn't missing something that I wanted to share. All right, now to the issue of this star. Now, the Christmas special version in our head that we sometimes recall, or the wishbone version of this, some PBS special version of this story that we picture in our heads, like this star appears to the wise men that are in the east, and the star appears in the east, and they follow it east, and they get to Jesus' house. But the actual chain of events is they're in the east, they see the star in the east, then nothing more is said about the star. They go west to Jerusalem. There they ask, where's the king of the Jews? Herod's scribes look him up, send him down to Bethlehem, and then it says the star that they had seen in the east went before them and went above the place where he was. So what's going on with this star? They said, specifically, they said in Jerusalem, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, or we saw his star in the east, and have come to worship him. So his star, okay, so unless the star appears in the sky saying Jesus' star with an arrow pointing to it, It says, and also, P.S., he's also the King of the Jews and the Messiah and all these things. We have to assume that they know something beforehand, and they see a star that to them is the sign of the arrival of the Messiah, the sign of his birth. So you could, I think there's one of two ways that that could be viewed. If the Magi had some prophecy from Daniel that we have, or something else, that they were expecting at a certain time that the Christ was to be born. So they measured time in a certain way, or they were looking for a specific appearance of some celestial body, and then when that thing appeared in a certain place or in a certain way, that either way was the indication that the Christ is born.
For anybody who's really interested, the best thing I've ever seen is called the Star of Bethlehem, which is amazing because Jupiter is like the king planet, and it's lining up, and it's a. I wish I could remember everything. I see it and remember it, but it is so amazing to see that. We actually have it on a DVD if somebody wanted to borrow it, but it's like the best explanation because if somebody looking in the heavens would actually have seen the alignments and the largeness of Jupiter along with
Mhm.
the star.
Right, so there's the,
Right, and then the retrograde of it, keeping it in an area. It's just amazing. And because we have computers now, you can actually take the night, like the stars, the heavens now, and you can back it out because God's a God of order. We can see what the heavens look like.
right.
So nowadays, you can actually go back and look for that, which has been done by this person who's not, he's very, very good. So it's called the Star of Bethlehem.
The Star of Bethlehem. I also saw another book that was the Christ Comet. Looked for the appearance of a comet as an astronomical sign. My personal issue with the naturalistic explanations for the initial appearance of the star is how it said when the star that they had seen in the east went before them and went above, where that seems to be a miraculous direction of the thing. And a person could say, like, well, it was in this part of the sky. It's like, well, they were traveling north to south, so why would it be in that part? Well, they came in from the east side of the village, and then it appeared in the right spot. For me, that's a lot of things to explain. It seems to me like they were looking for a certain time, and however that time was arrived at, they're like, hey, we need to go. And so they went to Jerusalem, because where else are you going to find the King of the Jews but in Jerusalem? These guys know how to read stars. They know how to read a map. So they went to Jerusalem. And it seems to me that the way it reads, the star that they had seen in the east went before them. Seems to be a miraculous description to me of something else. Now, maybe it was the moving of some celestial body, or maybe it was something else. Yes.
Say it reminds me of the cloud that they put before them, so that's.
Yes.
That's God leading them.
There was a lot of commentaries that I read made a comparison between that pillar of fire or that cloud that God's like, hey, look at this thing, follow me, follow it. Burning bush could be like another thing, like here's this burning bush, and you're drawn to it, drawn to the light. My personal theory that I saw written nowhere else, is let you have it for free, when it says, we saw his star in the east, or the star when it rose. Well, if you're familiar with basic astronomy, the stars appear everywhere, but there's only one star that appears in the east specifically. It's not a star at all, it's Venus. It's that morning star, an evening star. You either see it at sunset in the west or you see it at sunrise in the east. And turns out you can track time by that. It's like, oh, see it there one day, there the other day. An astronomer can track time by that. It could be that they're like, okay, it's, at the 100th appearance of the star in the east is what we're looking for, and when it hits that one's his star. It's like counting the moons. Like, okay, on the fifth moon, that's the moon that indicates, you can count by stars. So that's just mine, because the picture of a star in the east evoked for me Venus, which you only see in the east. That's written nowhere else, to my knowledge. So that's just my take. But like Janet pointed out, there's lots have been written about the star. One commentator said a lot of ink has been spilled over that subject. But the point was not the star really, but what the star pointed to. The star points to Christ. Okay, now what about these gifts? We got gold and frankincense and myrrh. Now the question first is there any meaning to them? We can attribute meaning to them, but is there any meaning to those three gifts? And if so, is that meaning that just Matthew is kind of attributing? Or is that meaning that the wise men also knew? Because perhaps the wise men gave those gifts inadvertently, and Matthew is pointing it out as this is significant. Well, I kind of, if we reverse engineer it, so let's look at what they could mean or might mean and see if it's plausible that those meanings could be derived by the wise men. So gold's the easy one. Gold is a gift fit for a king. That's, Solomon was brought gold. Lots of kings been presented gold as a gift. Gold's expensive, so that one's pretty straightforward. So if that indicates anything other than just being an extravagant gift, that is a kingly gift. Okay, the next thing is frankincense. Now, frankincense in the Old Testament was used primarily for worship. It was one of the ingredients for incense in the tent of meeting. It was also used with grain offerings and bread offerings. It was things like that, perfumey, smelly things. It's an extravagant gift just on its own. So what was that?
Isn't it also a priestly?
Okay, so there's two thoughts. Priestly gift, what would be the other option? Indicates his priesthood or his priestly nature. Not sure. The other one I was thinking of is his divinity. So incense is offered by a priest, but an incense is offered to God. So the thought is, would this more symbolize his priesthood or symbolize his divinity? I lean towards divinity personally because it's being offered to him. Gold's a gift for a king. Incense is a gift for God. I can see the priestly connection. Obviously, Jesus is a priest. He's our high priest, and we can draw that out. So I think there's some validity to that. I really could go both ways, but I lean towards the divinity part myself. And myrrh. In the Old Testament, myrrh was used for worship and perfume. It was one of the ingredients for the anointing oil used in the tent of meeting. It was also used in cosmetics. According to Christian tradition, myrrh is, I'll let you see if you can pick it out. But I will say that wine mixed with myrrh was offered to Jesus on the cross, and Nicodemus used myrrh when preparing Christ's body. So this would be symbolic of his death. And yes, Twanda. Oh, does it? I did not know it comes from a thorny tree. Yes. Myrrh comes from a thorny tree. I did not know that, but that's something that would have been known, I suspect. So another connection. It's all coming. All this stuff is coming out. It's like, wow, okay, there's some depth to this. No, it's not a random story after all. There's actually connections here. Okay, so the question would be: so if gold is could be a representation for Christ as a king, which we know he is, and if frankincense could be a representation of his, say, divinity, as we know he is divine, and myrrh is representation of his death, we know that Matthew knows those things as gospel writer. Would the wise men have known those things? So what would the wise men know? Then we go back out, we could always cop out and say, well, Daniel could have had anything revealed to him, and so could Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they could have passed on anything that they ever heard or knew about the Messiah. So maybe, maybe they knew.
We do know that when they left on the quest, they were seeking a king.
That's true. So king enough. They're like, where's the king of the Jew? Where's the king of the Jews?
Brought from wherever they came from. Would have been something they brought for a king.
And I'll also argue a step further that they must have thought that he was more than a king. There are lots of kings. I suspect they didn't go to every newborn king and do this thing. They went to the king of the Jews, at least because they had most likely a connection to heavenly prophecy that this one was to come, but something about him. This wasn't just to be any other ordinary king, and we just happened to, get the time right because of, divine, proclamation. There was something special about this one. So it seems to me, if you're going to be a part of the wise men and you're going to go on a journey with a lot of expensive stuff, that you're going not just to a king of the Jews, you're going to something more. Now, what was that more in their mind? Was that king of everybody? Was that just going to be a really super great king? Was that going to be, in fact, king of all nations? Daniel already, in Messianic prophecy, and Daniel already refers to all peoples and all nations. So are they thinking this is going to be our king as well? Have they made the next step to divinity? I don't know. But I do know that you don't just go worship someone else's king. I can imagine an Englishman going to go visit the queen, see if we can see the queen. I can imagine that. It's a little more weird if you told me that as an American, right? And it's even more weird if you say, like, hey, I'm going to take off, the whole summer, and I'm going to take a lot of expensive stuff, going to empty out my bank account and go give a gift to the queen. No, not even the queen's newborn great-grandson. And I'm going to stick this gold and myrrh into his baby hands, and then that's what I'm going to do. That seems weird, okay, unless you actually know something about that special one that has been born. So they've put together something more, I believe. So whether they know those things specifically, there's imagery there, and then there's also prophecies about gold and frankincense, and then I think another one, frankincense and myrrh, being brought to them. Where's that at? I got to look that one up. Could I get someone to look up Isaiah 60, verse 6? Isaiah 60, verse 6. Go ahead, Mike.
Vast droves of camels will converge upon you, dromedaries from Midian and Sheba and Ephah too, bringing gold and incense to add to the praise of God.
See, you have a picture of people traveling from the east to bring these gifts. So, if nothing else, it's more Old Testament coming together to show that this is the Christ. Think about all we've talked about, that maybe a Jew knows a lot more internally than we do right now. And they're reading this story like, whoa, wise men, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and all these other prophecies that Matthew directly quotes. It's like, wow, this is him. This is not a random inclusion, because it's not about narrating the birth account. It's about demonstrating who Christ is. Because if it was about the birth account, we'd see all this other stuff that, let's say, like Luke includes, that's not in Matthew. But Matthew's like, no, I'm going right to genealogy, and I'm going to show you that this prophecy, this prophecy, this prophecy fulfilled. That's what he does. So it's pretty incredible that these wise men take this journey knowing not everything, because they didn't even know where he was going to be born. They don't know everything. It's limited. Go ahead.
The fact that they didn't know exactly where he was born, they didn't go straight to Bethlehem.
Right.
If they had, they would not have had to go to Herod, which meant the prophecy would not have been fulfilled of all the children
Mm-hmm.
being slaughtered.
Yeah.
Okay, so that part had to be.
All that was foreknown.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
That's part of God's plan.
and it all comes together as God said it was going to. Would we take a journey that long, that expensive, that far out of our comfort zone? Like, would you take a journey because your dad and your granddad were told by your great-great-granddad's best friend that there was going to be a king of Panama born somewhere in Panama. And so you're going to go by horseback down through Mexico to Panama, with a lot of expensive stuff, with all your money put into gold. I mean, we're already getting really far-fetched, right? But that's essentially what we're talking about. These wise men that were some 400 years removed from Daniel's time, who lived in a pagan culture. Whatever Christian influence they had, I don't see these guys as just full-on Jews over there. They had some Jewish influence. These guys are most likely pagans who have adopted or have been passed on this messianic prophecy.
The word says, if we hunger and thirst after righteousness, we will be filled.
And that's right.
So, and it's to all people. So they're hungering and thirsting after righteousness, tells me, and they're seeking, tells me their hearts were already toward God.
Mm-hmm.
So whether they could be surrounded by pagan people, but they themselves had already focused their eyes on the one true God.
I'd say that's right. Any other questions about, maybe I've skipped over something, like what about this or what about that? Because we got a little more time left. Yeah, Larry.
I don't know how much they were directly familiar with the writings of Daniel. I don't know how much that was.
Yeah.
The writings were dispersed over
Yeah.
there before they came back
Who knows? Yeah.
to Israel. But his prophecies about kingdoms and the mountains going to fill the whole earth, indicating a worldwide kingdom planted by the hand of God. Excuse me. They had to see this as a worldwide kingdom, as a universal kingdom provided by God.
And I would say, in your question, would you be willing to go on an adventure? I think that many people do all the time. Missionaries that are sent out, they have to have in their heart saying, this is God's will for me to do that. I mean, you're leaving everything behind
Yes.
to go forward. And God God does that in our lives anytime He says, walk into the unknown. Are you willing to walk into it? It doesn't have to be a huge
Right.
basically needs to share Christ with them. Are we willing to be led by the Spirit?
It's what we have here is a big dramatic, moving out in faith. It's like, it's Abrahamic.
Going and yet be obeyed.
And it's similar when we have like these other examples, like Job. It's like, are you willing to suffer like Job? It's like, well, maybe a little bit. It's like, well, that's the, I don't know if that's the bar, but that's the example that's given for us.
What these all have in common is all the extreme behavior has in common is a higher power, to work for. Like if you didn't have that, you wouldn't do that. So I think that's why it's so revealing that they did something so crazy, because there was that higher power.
Yeah, because they weren't crazy people.
Right.
They weren't out of their mind. They were in their right mind, and they were obviously convicted of what they saw and what they knew.
This is just my take on it, but to me, I think they would have been somewhat surprised. Why they went to Jerusalem is because Jerusalem was the capital.
Right.
And where would you expect to find a king?
In the palace. Yeah.
In the capital.
Yeah.
And every indication is that this wasn't at his birth. This was maybe 2 years later.
Right.
It took him a while to get there. If a king is born, he's probably going to go to the capital pretty soon. So why go to the capital? Maybe because that's where they expect to find him. I think it's interesting that the star continued to show where he was. They were probably surprised that the Jews didn't know about him.
Yeah.
All the way over in Babylon or wherever they were from.
They come in. They say, "Hey, where's the newborn king of the Jews?" And they're like, "What are you talking about?"
Right, and then so they can find out where he was supposed to be born. They don't even know he's been born. Would have probably been a shocker for them. But that's just
Yeah.
a thought.
Ken.
You would think that when the angel of hosts appeared in the sky saying, "Glory to God in the highest, peace on earth, goodwill toward men," that everybody would see that.
I had that question too.
So that in play, whenever you look at the meaning of the word star in Hebrew, does not necessarily mean it was a celestial body. Very well could have been the Shekinah glory of God that can go and appear anywhere.
Sure.
Could have, for them to see it go, very well could have been the Shekinah, could have been the glory of God.
Yeah.
That appeared to them, because everybody in Jerusalem was clueless. Everybody that was around Jesus' home was clueless. But God has a way of bringing certain people in to the conversation while everybody else is perhaps too busy with their lives to notice anything. But he made sure that they saw that. And that also, when we talk about why were the wise men, something had to happen to initiate prophecy in the Old Testament that said, Rahab was crying for her children, they were no more,
Mm-hmm.
because they are no, they are
Right.
no more. Because Herod immediately after he saw that they had left and disregarded him, didn't give him the information, he immediately ordered for all the children to be killed from 2 years old and down.
Mm-hmm.
So that prophecy came true.
Mm-hmm.
The wise men had a big deal to do with that.
And a lot more after that, the out of Egypt I have called my son, because they ran to Egypt and they called him out.
He had to go to Egypt. Where was he going to get there? Why the circumstances for him to go? All of it was done to fulfill every single prophecy. When the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, when Jesus is resurrected, and he appears to them and says, "Why are you guys looking so sad?" And they say, "Have you been a stranger? Have you been underneath a rock all this time? You don't know what's going on." And they tell him about how Jesus was supposed to be the Messiah and all of these things. I found it so interesting that Jesus, whenever he not chides them, but whenever he corrects them, or whenever he explains to them, he says, how can you not believe all, the word all,
Yeah.
A-double-L, all that the prophets have said about me?
He expected them to put it together.
One thing, it was
That'll be a good takeaway for us here, because what Matthew has illustrated, what Ken's talking about, all of it together, which is what Matthew is doing in his Gospels, putting all this together, putting together a case for Christ. And as Jesus expected many of his disciples to put it together, maybe we need to put some things together, have a more broader view of the entire Scripture. God says the sum of your word, the psalmist says the sum of your word is truth. So you've got all these things to put together. We can get focused on one thing, but it's all of this is connected. It's all the Word of God. All right, that's all we have time for. About 3 minutes over. If you got more questions, we can come talk. We can visit. Had a good class. Enjoyed being with you all this week.